All right, well, welcome everybody to the Maryland Climate Solutions webinar. I'm David Blackstein, and I'm the facilitator for this webinar. I'm also the project manager for the Solve Climate by 2030 project. That this webinar is one of 50 or so that are going on concurrently today. We have them in nearly every state. We have them in 5 countries. Earlier today, I listened in on a webinar of a international college, the United World College, that has campuses around the world, and there are over 100 students and alums and others on that webinar sharing their ideas about building climate justice and climate solutions. So we're delighted to have all of you here in Maryland. I'm going to introduce our speakers in a moment, but I first want to thank and acknowledge Mount St. Mary's University, which is providing our technology here, and really appreciate them stepping up and making this all possible. We will be beginning with a video by our national project leader, my friend and colleague, Dr. Eben Goodstein, the director for the Bard Center for Environmental Policy at Bard College in New York. So we're going to, and Blade, you are recording this, correct? Okay. If we could ask that each of you, because we are recording this for future use, if we could ask each of you to turn off your cameras, then we'll have a higher quality audio and video recording for the students and others who are going to be watching this again. And we have everybody muted, and we'll be having our discussion in the chat. So let's begin with the national welcome from Dr. Eben Goodstein. Blade, we're seeing his lips move, but we're not hearing the audio.
Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030. Today, universities in almost all 50 U.S. states, Puerto Rico, D.C., and several other countries are hosting state and region-wide webinars focused on ambitious and feasible things that we can all do in our cities, our towns, and states in the coming year to really move the needle on climate change. Here is the most important idea to take home today. What you do locally will change the future. Fact. The U.S. state of Georgia is a top 10 solar state. The neighboring Sunshine State of Florida has very little solar power due to outdated laws and regulations. When we launched Solve Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today, entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action, we didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they are getting cheaper every day. Already, utility scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the US. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments, starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently the Chinese and Indians. Government policies have brought these industries to scale, and now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
And I want to add my thanks to each of you for joining us today. So we have about 100 people on already. We have over 170 that have registered. We also have several classes of students who are registered through their teacher or faculty members. So we have a good group of people here, and we're delighted to have each of you with us. So we're going to, as I say, this is one, as even described, one of 50 or so webinars that's taking place. I'm going to lay out for you our agenda and introduce our speakers, and then we'll get going. So we're going to begin with brief opening remarks from our three distinguished speakers. I'm going to ask them to first give us a bit of a summary of what happened and what didn't happen in the shortened legislature session in Maryland in 2020, this current year. And then we'll ask each one to give us one top climate policy action that's needed in Maryland. And then we will have a group discussion on how do we build an inclusive and powerful movement for climate justice and climate solutions in Maryland. We'll ask, what can students and other Marylanders do to advance climate justice and climate solutions? We'll primarily talk, go through that main agenda for about the next 45 minutes. And we invite you to submit your questions and comments in the chat function. We have Lori McGilvery from the Tacoma Park Mobilization Environment Committee who's going to be monitoring the chat and will be feeding in the questions. And we will be then asking the questions in the last half hour of the webinar, unless there's something that is really fits right in with the things that we're talking about in the first 45 minutes. And again, I ask you to kindly turn off your cameras because we're recording this. We'll have a stronger quality recording that will be available for viewing throughout the coming months, especially as many teachers and professors are going to be using this in this new world of virtual education. So I'm going to begin by introducing our three speakers. One of them is just wrapping up a meeting and will be joining us in a moment. But I'm delighted to have my friends. These are really the three of the top climate leaders in Maryland, starting with Delegate Lorig Charkoudian. Lorig is representing District 20, which is the area that I live in the Tacoma Park Silver Spring area. She's representing us in Annapolis. She serves in the General Assembly on the Economic Matters Committee, where she's been a champion for clean energy and climate justice and creating good jobs for Marylanders. Mike Tidwell is the executive director and founder of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, the single most effective regional climate change and clean energy organization working in the Chesapeake Bay region, primarily in Maryland and Virginia. Mike's training is as a journalist, and as part of his work in Louisiana, seeing the ravages of climate change on the coastal environment in Louisiana. In his fabulous book, Bayou Farewell, Mike realized that he couldn't just be a journalist and observing what was going on. He had to be an activist, and he's been an incredibly effective activist. And then our third speaker is Tamara Toles O'Laughlin. Tamara is the National Director of 350.org, the national organization founded by Bill McKibben to try to get us back down to 350 in the greenhouse gas emissions. Tamara is a Marylander. She lives in Baltimore. She's been a leader in the work in diversifying the environmental field and providing environmental justice for all. And Tamara, you need to unmute yourself, and we're going to call on you as our first speaker. And so I guess the first question, Tamara, why don't you start off and tell us a little bit more about 350.org and your work?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name's Tamara Toles O'Loughlin. Super glad to be in this conversation with so many amazing colleagues. So 350.org is the largest and most effective climate organization in the world, largely because we're one of the few organizations solely focused on climate, and one of two that works internationally. So that looks like 175 staff across the world. Our last big project was climate strikes to get 7.6 million people in the street. Our aim was to have 3 million. And that work was accomplished by working across climate, energy justice, environmental justice, and traditional resource and natural resource organizations, as well as supporting youth who you may know, including Greta Thunberg. So most of my work, that was, the climate strikes was my first assignment coming into 350. My job was to make sure we hit 3 million. So far, so good. In general, my day-to-day work looks a lot like supporting the US and Canada teams in developing innovative campaigns, picking the right targets and the right moments, and pushing the envelope in favor of science and the demands of justice, and increasingly supporting the centering of impacted communities in that work as one of the larger green group organizations focused on climate. So happy to talk about how my background in environmental law and environmental health helps to inform our work, which is largely focused on people and planet. But at the end of the day, climate, justice, economics, and health are the pillars with which we weigh whether or not we're doing a good job. So we cannot do great climate work if we are exclusive. We cannot do good climate work if we're not focused on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And in the climate space, that looks like making sure our work is multiracial and multi-generational, that the spokespeople that we educate, support, and push out for scrutiny by the public are Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are impacted by the work. We spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to push for accountability as we're in a moment of COVID and climate. Neither crisis is waiting for the other, which will really bring home to lots of folks that people and planet is not just a thing that we say. So I'm super happy to be in this discussion with folks leading in the work, and just to drive it home. So I met with our Maryland chapters just last evening. So we have about 6 or 7 really strong leaders all over Maryland who are holding down chapters in Harford County and Montgomery County. Mike is a big part of why that's true in Montgomery County for sure. Baltimore City, and even Southern Maryland. And in having conversations with them, we have conversations about how our climate and health, people and planet focus matters in the state of Maryland. And for us, there are a number of really important issues because Maryland is often viewed as a model state. A lot of the federal legislation that shows up is often borrowed from Maryland, with Virginia coming close behind with some real advances recently. But in the history of the work, Maryland builds it and tests it. DC applies it with very little capacity because it is not, in fact, the state. And Virginia, everyone goes like this until something happens. So until very recently, a lot of people went home to Virginia to make good stuff happen. So I think it isn't just proximity that matters, it's people. And we care a lot about making sure that the priorities that we have in Maryland reflect the larger call to move people, power, and money in a direction of justice.
Great. And speaking of making things happen in Virginia, let me turn to Mike Tidwell, and he can talk about the work of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network and some of the big wins they had in Virginia.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I just want to thank you, David, and my good friend, Even Goodstein, for organizing these state calls. Even goes way back in the climate movement, 20 years or so, and really, really effective on campuses and in the broader public. It's great to be with Tamara and my delegate in Annapolis, Lorig Charkoudian. So thanks everyone for getting on this call, and all of you calling in from all over the state. It's really great to have such a big call. Yeah, in terms of the region, I do think that Maryland has traditionally been a leader on climate policy. That's why the CCAN has been around for 18 years, and our very first campaign that we ran was in 2002 to pass a mandatory clean electricity standard in Maryland. And it was a weak standard, 7.5%. And it took us 3 years to pass it, and it was considered radical and exotic. And that was quite a while ago. Now we're at a mandate to get to 50% renewable electricity in Maryland. But 18 years ago, no one knew where their electricity came from or and needed to be educated on climate. We've come a long way in that respect. And yes, in Virginia in March, the Virginia General Assembly passed the single biggest climate bill in the region, honestly. And truth be told, I think that Virginia has now leapfrogged Maryland in terms of comprehensive climate policy. The Virginia Clean Economy Act, which passed, I think, on March 8th, mandates that all the state's coal plants shut down by 2030, effectively shut down by 2030. All the biomass plants, dirty biomass plants, will shut down by 2024, and all fossil fuel generation for electricity will shut down by 2045. Just amazing. The bill is effectively a 45% renewable portfolio standard, so it mandates at least 45% clean electricity by the year 2030, just right behind Maryland. And it does a lot of other really great things. It has Virginia join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It invests about $500 million in low-income home weatherization, includes a social cost of carbon in all PSC decisions on energy projects. So it's an amazing bill. And that bill comes on the heels of the District of Columbia's Omnibus Clean Energy Act, which the mayor signed in January of 2019, which is 100% mandate for clean electricity by the year 2032. Also does a lot for electric vehicle charging stations and electric vehicle expansion and solar, especially on low and moderate income households. So honestly, we were hoping before the General Assembly session of 2020 and Annapolis got shut down 3 weeks early because of the virus, we were hoping that Maryland could pass one or two big bills so that it could stay in front of our partners in the region. But because of circumstances, which we'll talk about on this call, we were not able to get across a big bill in Maryland this year. So effectively, I think that Virginia has the edge now, and I'm hoping that inspires us Marylanders to fight harder and to elevate our ambitions on climate and get ready for a special session that's coming up probably in May or June, and then come back in January of 2021 with some real ambitious and equitable climate legislation.
That's probably a great transition to turn to Lorig to talk about yourself as work. And the delegate, I should also point out that Lorig has a doctorate in economics and is also a professional mediator. So she is multidisciplinary and incredibly multitasking in her effectiveness.
Well, thank you, David. I do mediation work professionally, but mostly naturally, I love competition. So challenge accepted, Mike and Tamara. And we've got to beat Virginia now, it's clear, if for no other reason than Virginia's ahead of us. So my name's Delegate Lorig Charkoudian, and I represent District 20. I'm scanning names on this call, and I see many familiar ones, so hello. And I want to start by just saying thank you, because a lot of the names that I see popping up are people who I've seen in Annapolis working over the last several years to really build a environmentally just set of policies. And And I'm just really excited to be part of this call to talk about both specifically where we could head, but also specifically how do we organize and get the people power moving, because that is in fact the only thing that works. It's the only thing that's ever worked. And so I'm honored to be on with two people who do a great job at getting people power moving, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I guess in terms of my organization, I assume most folks know what a General Assembly does. We pass laws for the state. So right now, most of us are spending our time surveying constituents in terms of right now folks are really suffering. And so we are spending a lot of time making sure that people have the unemployment insurance and the businesses stay open and the people know where to get food and how to get health care. And that's also a really important part of our job is the direct service to people. And throughout all of it, I would just reinforce what we heard from the introductory video and what we heard from my other colleagues on this panel, which is that this crisis, I think there's a temptation to sort of say, well, put other policies aside and just focus on getting through this crisis. But I think what the crisis does is it shows us how crucial it is to get all of our policies right, all of our long-term policies right, all of our policies that are grounded in science, and understand what could come, what is here already. I mean, we see the suffering from climate change already, but how much worse it can be. And this really kind of shows us that. So even while we're taking care of our friends and our neighbors and our constituents, it's really crucial that we're also building out the policies to prevent us from being in the same place, both from a public health perspective, but also from a public health perspective that comes out of some climate crisis.
Great. Well, thank you all. So we've already started talking a little bit about the Maryland legislative session, but let's get a little bit deeper. Mike, you want to start this off in that place?
Yeah, well, we had a number of bills that were in the mix in Annapolis. I think Lorig's going to talk about a number of them. The top priorities for my organization, Chesapeake Climate Action Network, was a pretty straightforward piece of legislation called the Climate Solutions Act. It was Senate Bill 926, House Bill 1425. And basically what it would have done had it passed, had the legislative session not ended early, was it would have recalibrated the state's greenhouse gas emissions goals, because in October of 2018, of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's largest scientific collaboration in the history of the planet, under the rubric of the United Nations, those scientists said we have to do more faster. And even Goodstein talked about that in the opening video. And basically, the world scientists are saying that wealthy countries like the United States, and certainly one of the United States' wealthiest states, Maryland, must cut emissions at least 60% below 2006 levels by the year 2030. Currently, our state only has a goal of cutting emissions 40% below 2006 levels by 2030. So the Climate Solutions Act would have fixed that. It would have basically increased our commitment, our mandatory statutory commitment to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions pretty significantly. In addition to that, it would have done some amazing things like create funding to plant 500,000 trees across the state every year for the next 10 years. It would have done a lot on building model green schools in every county in Maryland across the state. It would have done a lot on mandating solar on large commercial rooftops that qualify. So it was a really great bill that, one, addressed the science, the changing science on climate change, and also did something on carbon sequestration, as well as some other features. Not the biggest bill we've ever passed in Maryland, not as perhaps transformative as the Clean Energy Jobs Act last year, but a great bill. And so we'll probably be coming back with some version of that next year. Another bill that we were closely following was a bill that, believe it or not, our Public Service Commission, our commissioners, 5 of them appointed by the governor to regulate utilities and utility matters, is not required when they approve a energy generation plant or weigh in on a pipeline or anything having to do with clean energy, dirty energy, anything on energy, the PSC is not required to take climate change into account in their decisions. It's just stunning and hard to believe that in the year 2020, they could approve a gas-fired plant or theoretically a new coal plant without considering its impact on the climate. So we had a bill that would have required just exactly that the PSC take into account climate change and the state's climate greenhouse gas reduction goals in improving any projects going forward. That obviously would have made it nearly impossible to build any new fossil fuel plants in the state and would have been badly needed, and it's still badly needed in state regulatory law. So that bill will likely return next year. So those are the two biggest bills we were following that were put on pause because of the early shutdown of the General Assembly, but nonetheless still need to become law.
Great, thanks, Mike. And we can talk a little in a moment about sort of why some of these things didn't happen or didn't happen in these cases, not just the timing. But let's turn to Lorig, who was our champion there, fighting the good fight. And you can tell us how it looked from inside the world there of Annapolis legislation.
Sure. Well, so Mike mentioned one of my bills, the PSC consideration of climate. I'll talk about a couple others, my bills, and then a few of other folks' bills, and then I know Tamara is going to talk about a few others. I will say that, part of what happened is out of all of the bills, if you were tracking kind of all the climate bills that were there, some of them got out of the House, some of them got out of the Senate, and then it was sort of the post-crossover period that we lost. And so I think there's other reasons, and there were certainly industries that were fighting some of our really good bills, and that's why some of those bills died. But I do think several of these bills would have made it through and will make it through next year if it hadn't been for the early end of the session. So I guess if you want in the Q&A, we can talk more about the details of the ones that may have had a tough go of it even in a normal session. But right now I'm just going to highlight a couple bills. One is the bill to increase low-income energy efficiency upgrades. And so I think folks probably know that when we're looking at energy, there's a efficiency and conservation first approach of really looking at how, the cleanest electron is the one that we don't use. And so the need to really move on energy efficiency generally, and then to target our investments in low-income housing, because those are the folks who are most energy burdened, who struggle most to pay their electricity bills. Those are the folks who end up with electric bills that can lead eventually to having electricity shut off and sometimes to homelessness. And so it's a really important sort of targeted effort. And this particular bill, not only did it have the broader goal of investing more in energy efficiency and low-income housing, but one of the places that we took the money from to do that was money that was designated for expansion of fracked gas across the state, which the Maryland Energy Administration has really been promoting expansion of fracked gas. And there's this chunk of money from a AltaGas merger that's been focused on expansion of fracked gas. And so what we did with this is we said, okay, we're going to take that money and other money and target it towards low-income energy efficiency. So the bill did not pass in time, but we did succeed before the end of session in getting at least this year's budget allocation for the Natural Gas Expansion Fund, which is about $5.5 million, to be taken out of the Natural Gas Expansion Fund and directed towards low-income energy efficiency. It's fenced off so that now one very specific thing folks can do now, or maybe a month from now, is really pressure the governor to release that money so it gets used for low-income energy efficiency. But the way that we've set the budget, he can't use it for natural gas expansion. So that was sort of a minor victory in a larger sort of bill that didn't move forward. The next bill I want to highlight was our community choice energy bill. And so this is, we like to talk about the concept of energy democracy, designed to let local government in conjunction with residents, decide about energy supply purchases. And so it allows for lower cost energy for residents. It allows for more renewable energy, and it also allows for more local generation, resulting in local economic development. So that was a huge effort, and a lot of people, as I said on this Zoom, I see the names of a lot of people who put their heart and soul and all their time into that, and we came real close, but ultimately it didn't get out of the Senate before we had to adjourn. Another bill that I want to highlight was the transition off of coal and just transition for workers bill that was a priority for the Sierra Club this year, and the goal behind that was to put some timelines in place around transitioning off coal, and then specifically to have concrete planning done, and then have specifically having plans for workers whose careers have been in coal to have a transition and to have funds and to have training to shift to other industries. I think one of the things when we talk broadly about equity and justice in this area is making sure that we have the just transition, but also that the jobs that people are transitioning into are really good jobs, and in fact that they're union jobs whenever possible, because of the importance of unions in our democracy and in protecting workers and workers' rights. And so that was a really important bill. Also didn't get out. There was hopefully we're going to be working with a number of stakeholders in that process over the summer. There was sort of a commitment by leadership of the committees to keep that conversation going over the summer, and I'm hoping to be part of that conversation so that we'll come in next year with something that could move. Another really important bill that almost made it out is the plastic bag ban. I think hopefully folks are aware of connections between waste and climate change, and then specifically plastics and the role of fossil fuels in both creating plastics and then in managing the waste that comes out of plastics, in addition to the damage that plastics cause to the broader ecosystems. So we had a plastic bag ban, and it passed out of the House, and it almost made it out of the Senate. Again, it was a timing issue. I think in the last day is when it sort of started to move out of the Senate. So I do feel hopeful for that one in the next session. It's been a long time coming as we've sort of built towards that particular being ready to pass that particular ban. And again, one of the things I'll mention about that one is that the work that's been done across the state at the local level, the counties and the municipalities and their work on ending the use of plastic bags or doing the bag fees or what have you, have all been really important in putting the pressure then on having the industry want something that's more, retail industry want something that's more universal across the state. So I'll just kind of mention that as a side note of the work that gets done at a local level that really puts pressure then on having some of the statewide bills. Staying on waste for a moment, I also had a bill to increase the compost infrastructure in the state. And again, if folks don't know in terms of what happens with our waste, both landfill and incineration, which we're going to talk about more in just a moment, contribute in CO2 and pollutants, but also in methane emissions. And so there's a crucial need to address our waste management system, both because of the waste itself, but also because of the impact on climate change. So I had a bill that would have built out the compost infrastructure, and that one also didn't make it out. That one, frankly, wasn't going to make it out, I think, even before our early ending. And so if folks have other questions about that, we can discuss that one later. And the last one I'll mention as it relates to waste before I pass it off is I had the bill that right now in the state, there's 2 incinerators, which again, tomorrow's going to talk more about the bigger picture issues around environmental justice and incineration. But one of the things that happens right now in Maryland is that the ash from the incinerator can count towards a county's recycling goal. And in the state, in Baltimore, the use of the incinerator counts as a reduction in waste in terms of Baltimore's recycling goals. And so I had a bill that was designed to just sort of fix that loophole and say, incineration is not recycling. And so whatever, whether you use incineration or not is a separate issue, but it's not recycling. And so let's fix that. And that bill actually was assigned both to environment and transportation and also economic matters. And it made it out of environment and transportation, but it died in economic matters. And it actually does have some, it was, when I originally put it in as a, let's just be transparent and honest and accounting for recycling so we can get good numbers and improve them. later, we actually found out that there was a waste management, it was a waste hauler, I'm not sure which one. So the waste hauler was taking Mom's Organic Markets plastic bags from them, charging them for quote unquote recycling them. And Moms found out at some point that they were actually incinerating them. And when Moms called them on it, they said, well, but look, there's this in this law, like incineration is part of the recycling. It counts towards recycling. So, so it actually, beyond just the accountability and transparency of our recycling numbers, it has really concrete business implications in terms of whether or not, in terms of what businesses are doing with that information. So what we'll probably be bringing that bill back again next year as well. And we could talk, I think after Tamara talks a little bit about the bigger picture around incineration, maybe we could talk about the politics of it as well. And I'll stop there, I think.
Yeah, good. So let's turn to Tamara now to give us the bigger picture perspective, and also, maybe to Tamara, if you can help us to answer the question. I mean, I listen to these things and they sound so obvious, and that we should all be doing them, but obvious, and even in a green slash blue state, Maryland doesn't necessarily translate. So, Tamara, are you still with us here? I think we just lost her. While we're waiting for her to come back on, Laura, do you? Oh, okay, here we go. Tamara.
That was a bit surprising, trying to dial back into the call.
Okay, there
so
you go.
Yeah, just to pick up a little bit, I think I want to set a little bit of context on climate action in Maryland. I would say, as someone who has one foot in local work and one foot in national and global work, I would say that I think Maryland has the potential to do incredible work. I think with as much will as it has work, it could be as progressive as California. It makes as many experiments, asks good questions, and calls them. So I think the issue is not about having hardworking folks who want to make the law. It's about having enough muscle behind the work that they're doing, and a really fantastic moving into, a couple of decades of work of real education of the General Assembly. That way it's a place where good experiments happen. So I think in the last year or two, there have been some pretty radical shifts. And the idea that we're in a moment where environmental health is really at the center of so many structural damages, the threads are being pushed. So we're in a moment where climate and health seem to be the lenses through which we can gauge every single problem that we are currently having. Climate is the context for the global pandemic, and it will be interesting to see how such a robust template for real legislative movement responds to these twin priorities going forward. In terms of the pieces of legislation that went forward in 2020 that I'm most excited about, as one of the original founders of the constitutional amendment in the state of Maryland for environmental rights, let me tell you that it's important that we don't just enshrine the law in regulations, which are important for how the rubber meets the road, or in rhetoric and resolutions, but where does the bill actually force action at the state level? And in Maryland, there's an Environmental Rights Act that has been raised twice. And we'll be back in 2021, which will require constitutional amendment, which will mean there has to be a referendum at the state level on your ballot to be able to approve it, to have a constitutional amendment in the state constitution, in the review of in the rights section, that guarantees your right to be able to call the question on whether or not environmental infractions and harm violate your right of future enjoyment of climate and of people and planet in the state of Maryland. And the bill last year was the Healthy Green Maryland Amendment, and has since transformed into the Environmental Rights Act, and really was championed by Stephen Lafferty and then Delegate Von Stewart. It was HB 517, and it is as imaginative a firefight as you could get into if you want to draw the ire big industry and a David and Goliath match try to push for a constitutional amendment for environment that enshrines people's health and puts the word climate into the Constitution at the state level. There have only been 2 states that have ever done it. Montana, the organization that I'm chair of, Women's Voices for the Earth in Missoula, Montana, led the way on getting the Montana version of it, and Pennsylvania, which has had fairly the most hard-won success in a slew of losses on protecting the public's health when environment is in jeopardy, because they had a constitutional amendment that was revived by a specific set of legal cases. So that's an area where I think you can talk about the biggest forum where the most power could be put to force for the largest good. That will be an ongoing fight, and I would love to hear from folks about what kinds of situations might trigger it, what the concerns are, and what the needs are going forward, as a lot of counties in the state are putting forth their own resolutions in support of this right. Following that, there's a related work on the Public Service Commission. So some of the original pieces of legislation on health and human health specifics at the Public Service Commission were launched through a health impacts assessment bill that was launched to force to call the question about whether or not health is even a consideration when there's so much more information on the books about impacts to people's health that comes from our health department. That work will probably take the form of another vehicle in the next session, because health in all policies is work that the General Assembly has already taken up in prior years. The General Assembly approved a multidisciplinary task force to review all of the state's regulations and look for places where health should be a factor but isn't considered. And the way that I've always thought about that is when we look at the regulatory and statutory structure that we've built, it's like going to a party. I'm going to date myself and say, you go to a party, you have your camera and you're taking Polaroids of everyone as they're doing things, and you get home from the party after you've shaken all your photos and you realize you're not in any of them because you were too busy watching other people have a good time. That's what our regulatory structure looks like in the state of Maryland, because all of that law is built as though human beings are writing it, with no connection to how human beings would enforce it, what our future health what our future health and safety might look like. And so going back to do a full review on the regulatory structure to figure out where health should be pointed to is a long process that the General Assembly signed off on. The report came back from that work about 2 years ago, and the idea that health is not a consideration in transportation, health is not a consideration in the development of any infrastructure. Health is not a consideration in development of energy access infrastructure as we move from polluting forms of energy to cleaner forms of energy in the state of Maryland. So just want to flag that these are really big concepts that could use the minds of young people with energy to really push for this work going forward. The last thing I want to talk about is incineration, which really is a thing we shouldn't we shouldn't still be talking about it, because we have so much information about how horrifying it is, what it does to people's health, and how it sets the stage. So as a resident of Baltimore, I can assure you that we are in a moment where COVID will have a greater impact on communities that live in the footprint of the incinerator. People that live, we are already as a state in the downwinds of the Ohio River Valley, and there are incredible resources about what that means for our air quality and our relationship to sister states, including Pennsylvania. But when we are polluting at home, we are also polluting the future. And so in thinking through, and there have been a number of really stalwart acts to try to wrangle incineration, because when we thought it was a good idea, when we thought burning trash solved problems, it reminds me of back in the olden days when we used lead as a sweetener because it made the tea taste better. These are things that we did in a moment without enough information, and when you know better, you do better. So finding out that clean energy isn't just stuff that you could blow white smoke, but actually has health impacts, should have caused a reverse course in the way that Maryland does business of burning trash. So among the things that Lorig mentioned, she did refer to HB 179, among others, which are really looking at how did we codify this mistake? How do we decide that things that were clean are continue to be clean when we get new information? So looking at the pandemic and the world that will exist once it is made it run its course, we have to think more closely about what we're agreeing to, how we verify whether it's still good work, and if we're in fact looking at the human health impacts of decisions that we make. So happy to talk about the Public Service Commission, the pushes for health impact assessments, what the Health and All Policies Commission will be doing going forward, and how the end of fossil fuels in America is contingent on us stopping the effort to make money off of pollution, and what that means to Baltimore, what it means for the state of Maryland, and what it could mean for communities who are sitting at home with compromised immune systems in the middle of a pandemic, which will be only one of many. As what Mike spoke to about the IPCC, one of the things it points to is that we will have more of these kinds of conflagrations as the climate is degraded. And so what are we doing to prepare this generation and the next generation for a future in our state?
Well, you've all laid out a lot of issues. Now I'm going to try to push you each to give us one big policy action that you would like to see happen, and let's focus in on Maryland. So Mike, you want to go first, and one big action and a fairly concise accounting of that big action.
Well, I will say that just in the last 48 hours, New York State on Sunday passed a kind of green stimulus bill called the New York Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. Look it up. It's amazing. It basically says we're going to build a lot of wind and solar and do a lot of weatherization, and we're going to do it quickly to the benefit of a lot of people, especially low and moderate income people who are being hurt the most by the coronavirus. So I just learned about that even since we last talked yesterday, David. So again, that's the New York Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. I do think that when the Maryland General Assembly comes back in special session, whenever that winds up being, they need to look at some kind of green stimulus bill, and it could be that New York State has set the table for something that we could think about during a special session to just get wind and solar moving faster. For example, Ocean City's been opposing offshore wind power, and they've delayed it. And frankly, Governor Hogan has dragged his feet on it as well. What if right now in Ocean City, where all the hotels are closed and all the restaurants are closed, we were actually building offshore wind farms, essential workers doing essential work in terms of laying cable and deploying wind turbines and blades? That would be good for our economy right now when we need it the most. But in terms of next year, 2021, I think that we still need to come together as a community and figure out what that bill is going to be, that big bill in 2021, given the economic recovery that we're still going to be in, given that we can't hit pause on the climate crisis. We've got to go faster and further. I like what New York has also done with the New York Renews Coalition, a bill they passed last June that dramatically expands their commitment to clean energy. So in terms of a really big bill in 2021, obviously we need to shut down our coal plants. We need to change our scientific commitments to climate pollution reductions. We need to have a stimulus factor. So I think we're just looking at an evolving, emerging sort of emergency climate bill that will come into better focus the closer we get to January 2021, I believe.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I think that's a little bit more than one idea, but I know there's a lot of good ones. But we'll wrap it as a climate emergency bill emphasizing a green stimulus. So, Lorig?
Yeah, well, so I actually am going to break the rules for a second also. Sorry, David.
That's okay.
Because I want to say, I am going to tell you what I think the big thing is that we should be focusing on. But first I want to say, I think it's important to have the big things, but I also think it's always important to have a lot of little medium-sized things. I mean, if you look at the stuff that we've been talking about, there's places where we've made mistakes in the past, considering incineration, clean energy, considering it recycling, consider leaving off on our list of things that the PSC has to consider, leaving off climate change. And so it's really important that in addition to the big stuff that really moves the needle, that we're continuing to look at where we're adjusting other pieces of our policies to make sure that they're aligned and we're all headed in the right direction. So I don't want to diminish the value of the multiple small, medium-sized things, even while highlighting getting everybody behind. And it does take everybody. So it's important to have one big thing that everyone's organized behind, but also moving all the other stuff. So I do think I'm actually was going to build on what Mike's comments were. I think that hopefully what we're going to see in the near future is that we're going to see federal money coming to Maryland in a stimulus fashion. This is what happened last time in 2009 with the stimulus bill, and there were, the shovel-ready projects. And so I think hopefully what we're going to be able to do then as a state, and I think this is where the state being able to prioritize where that money gets invested. I think it's really important that we look at a number of things in addition to solar and wind. And again, in the 2009 process, I think the investment tax credits were transitioned to cash, essentially direct grants. So something like that, but also really looking at Maryland infrastructure. And so I would just remind folks that, the importance of transit, the importance of complete streets, of the bike lanes and so on in addressing climate change. And those potentially, if the stimulus package that comes from the federal government is similar to the previous one, those would fit. Energy efficiency and weatherization, which is where I started. And I think we could radically ramp that up. And those are also create really good jobs and jobs that folks can be trained into relatively quickly. And then I just want to highlight the grid infrastructure. I think this is where it gets a little bit arcane and maybe boring for some people, but the way we do grid investments can really make a big difference in terms of how easy or hard it is to bring on more renewables, both large scale renewables, utility scale renewables, but also especially distributed renewables, microgrids, solar plus storage, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of kind of big picture grid infrastructure pieces that I think under a broader infrastructure investment, federal stimulus, if we were to direct those funds, we could make some major changes in the grid in Maryland, in addition to specific deployment of renewables. The grid infrastructure improvements allow us to bring on those renewables in a more efficient way. And that's also really important. So I think that a stimulus package that kind of focuses in those 5 or 6 directions would really move the needle on climate change and also create a lot of good local jobs.
Great, thank you. And I'll point out one of the reasons that I'm pushing for the one is, and I think we can summarize these in the one, is that with the 50 or so, we don't quite have every state, but the nearly 50 state webinars, that we're going to get 3 big ideas from each state. We're going to turn this into a presentation that you will all have access to. And so associated with Maryland will be these 3 ideas, and then we can look at how these compare with the other states. And so for the first time really through this project, we're going to have a national agenda consisting of state level initiatives. And I think that's, and I should actually, one other thing that I want to say before I turn to Tamara, because I think it is a good transition to go from the state to the federal, but thank you all who are making the comments and the questions in the chat. We're not ignoring you. Lori is compiling them and summarizing them and emailing to me. And after Tamara goes, we're going to start asking your questions. So thank you. So Tamara, your big idea, please.
Yes, just so I could tomorrow. Hey, that is my pet peeve in life.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think the exciting thing about being able to operate in this space is that in real life, one forum is not waiting for another. And I think it's really important for us to think about connecting state and federal action. Maryland is unique in this moment because as we face many levels of dereliction at the level of government, failed calls for a Green New Deal, inaction in places where we should have had it in the halls of Congress, we have another route. So the governor of the state of Maryland is also the head of the National Governors Association. So in this moment, carrying 2 hats, very important hats that determine where resources, people, and people go, what kind of relationships are made by the most senior executive at the state level. It's really important that a state that is known for great environmental ideas has real climate action at the helm of climate and COVID lens. So I think it's really important for folks to think about ways to leverage the ideas you have heard about here to push for a climate and health agenda coming from our governor in every seat that he sits in, and pushing for putting a thumb on the scale for the future, not for any specific action, but for specific responses into the stimulus that provides economic recovery. At 350, we have a list of 5 things that we would like to come out of a just recovery. And they're really just a list of the ways that climate and health impact people and planet. It'll be really easy for us to think through how the role of being the governor of this state should inform the idea that process can actually build progress for the larger group. So I think it would behoove everyone here to focus on climate solutions and just transition and composting and incineration and public health, but it all fits under the category of what are we doing to move the needle for the largest number of people in the time of climate and COVID. And so we use every lever at your discretion to push our governor to do the right thing, not just in meting out the dollars, but in making sense of the policy that he presides over.
So let me follow up with that with one of the questions that's come in here, because rightly we're talking about the reality that we're dealing with the COVID and the economic collapse. So one of the questions, and you some of you have already addressed this a little bit, but Republicans and some Democrats are already saying that with the money expended for coronavirus relief, there'll be no funds available for green initiatives. It's a sad irony, as many of the health issues associated with climate change, especially in community of color, make people more vulnerable to the virus. So what do the speakers think are the chances of moving forward on green initiatives, given the economic impact of COVID-19? And I'll just add to that some of you, some of the participants may know that there's a group headed out of the McCarg Center at University of Pennsylvania, and Dan Kamen at University of California, Berkeley, who is chairing our California webinar that'll take place in about 3 hours, are pushing for a 4th green stimulus legislation, which I know our Congressman Jamie Raskin in District 8 has told me he thinks it's a fabulous idea. So let's, Tamara and then maybe Lorig and Mike, dig in a little bit more on, given the COVID reality, the way that money is changing hands quickly now, what are the realities, and how do we as a community push that money so that it's not just restoring business as usual, but restoring communities is better?
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in and say that political reality is always dictated by pressure. Where are the pressure points? So the public messaging that climate will not come out is a test. It's a test to all of us who care about this work, who want a future that we can rely on, that on a livable planet, and don't want to die on a fiery gas ball, to accept that premise or to reject the premise. So in thinking through, signaling that there won't be enough money for climate while stimulus 1, 2, and 3 manage to sneak enough bailouts in and compound the amount of dollars that can be received by big oil, coal, and gas through a number of different royalties, subsidies, programs, tax giveaways, and general rollbacks of hard-won policy. I think if we manage to fit so many giveaways to a dying industry into the first 3, the least we could do is fit in some investments into the future, into 4 and 5, because the way it looks, like just based on the last recession we were in, there would have to be essentially 5 stimulus packages in order to keep us from going deep into a recession. Much longer conversation that I'm not going to get into here, but I do think it's really important to recognize that this is a test. It's only a test. And if you accept the premise that we don't have time for climate, you will be making it true. So reject that premise forthrightly. Among other things that you could be doing there is pushing back on that, demanding that another stimulus happen, demanding that it focuses on climate and COVID, demanding that we stop putting money into a dying industry and into health and people and planet. These are the kinds of things that, whether you call it a Green New Deal or not, we will always need infrastructure because it's crumbling in Maryland and other places. We will always need jobs because the economy is the driving engine for our wealth. And we will always need human health because bears are not sitting around trying to solve climate on our behalf. So all things being equal, reject the premise that there won't be another stimulus, fight for it every time you hear from it, and push for climate and COVID.
Thank you, Tamara. And let's, Lorig, in addition to the question, let me just amend it with a more specific question that's come in about what's likely to happen in the Maryland special session, and will there be some sort of a state stimulus package, or is it just how you're using the federal money, and sort of how does the community get behind this Green New Deal stimulus package that Tamara was talking about?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I just want to start by saying is that there is not a specific plan for an interim legislative session. Like, there's nothing on the books yet. We don't have dates. We don't have guidelines for what that's going to look like. And so I'm just saying that because I think we all want one. I think there's a lot of work that we'd like to push through. I think there's potentially vetoes that need to be override and other emergency legislation we'll need to put through. But none of that is set in stone. And so I think to just kind of broaden it out, I think what everyone ought to be doing is thinking about where it is that we need to go. And Tamara's done a good job of laying that out. I want to add a few things to it, but start getting the messaging right. And the messaging might need to get right for some kind of an interim legislative session if we have an opportunity to take some federal money and direct it. The messaging might need to be right so that the governor directs money that he gets in the interim if we don't meet before next January, or the messaging might need to be right so that we're all lined up and in the right direction for next January when we know we're going to be meeting. And so I don't think we want to sort of put our eggs in the basket for a specific legislative session in May or June, which may or may not happen. But I think if we're moving in the right direction, then we're ready for May, we're ready for June, or we're ready for January. And so I do think that the messaging is really important. I think highlighting the connections between the people who are suffering more now, the environmental justice issues of the people who have asthma, and they have asthma because they're living in the shadow of coal-fired power plants and incinerators, that they are the ones who are most at risk to have complications and potentially to die from this virus, and making those connections. Talking right now, I think someone in the chat box mentioned agriculture. The local food system, which many of us have been saying for years, is crucial both to get it right for environmental and climate reasons, for our health, but also to be ready from a adaptation perspective, to be ready for the possible to have more resilience in terms of our access to food. And now we're seeing that, and we're seeing how crucial the farmers markets are and the access to the food, and the, looking at those supply chains. So taking this opportunity to not say, oh, but don't forget climate, but taking this opportunity to say, this is still about climate. Like what we're seeing right now, and the challenges that we're seeing, and what we're seeing as the possible solutions, the local resilience where we're seeing that, like that's all the same conversation as the climate conversation. And so like making those connections as much as possible is really important. So it doesn't look like it's a second thought. Like we don't have time for climate because we're focused on the crisis. Climate is the crisis. So,
and by the way, the Virginia General Assembly announced today that they're going to have a veto session in 2 weeks outdoors. They're going to gather separately, the Senate and the House outdoors. They're going to figure out the communication, how they're going to do it. So I think there may be some creative ways that even the Maryland General Assembly can meet, hopefully, during this time of crisis. And I just wanted to say, whatever stimulus comes from the federal government, we want to spend it the right way in Maryland. But there are a lot of things Maryland can do without federal stimulus, and that is, again, just accelerate the regulatory approval of the wind and solar projects that companies already want to build. There's utility scale solar projects that are ready to go, but are being held up effectively by the Public Service Commission. And offshore wind, we know that's taken forever. We passed the Offshore Wind Act of 2013 in 2013, and still Governor Hogan is effectively dragging his heels on this. And he should tell his president of the Republican Party to accelerate the push for offshore wind if they really want to create jobs. So there's a lot that our governor can do, and there's a lot the state can do in terms of tax credits and regulatory acceleration for projects that are already waiting to be built.
So one of the it's more a comment, but I think it's a question that sort of fits with this from Elizabeth Bunn. If we direct recovery monies to projects to both create quality jobs and address climate disruption, we have an opportunity to create vibrant coalitions that have evaded us to date. And so let's talk a little bit more about just how do we really build the political power that we need to make these things happen. Who wants to jump in? Other than all of you.
Is that Tamara?
I'll go second, just to be different.
Okay. Well, I'll just say you need to do it because my colleagues need to hear from you. So, I mean, what I want to highlight is that there are, and I think that everyone knows this, there's big money, and big money is associated with big power that does not, is just, like everyone knows all these things I'm about to say, but I'll just say it anyways. I mean, there's has a vested interest in keeping, the science deniers going, keeping the ideas that a state really can't make enough of a difference. So why would you want to, make the changes at the state level? Let's just wait till the federal government gets it right. A lot of vested interest in just within the state in big money and keeping things the way they are and slowing things down as much as possible, slowing the transition down as much as possible. And so the only thing that can overcome that in Annapolis is organizing, and it's organizing its people, and it's organizing coalitions, and it's organizing across, I think to the point that was made in this chat box, organizing across the groups of folks who often have very similar thinking and a similar vision for the world, but don't necessarily always work together. And there's lots of reasons for that, and there's historic reasons for that. And I think Tamara's been working on that and has a really good analysis of it. And so I would let her take the lead in that. But it is the only thing that's really going to make the change happen in Annapolis. And the other thing that I just want to highlight about that, as someone sitting in the chair in Annapolis, is really making sure it's across groups, but also across the state. And so, we have representatives in Annapolis from every part of the state. And if you look at some of the committees, it's really important that those members are hearing from their own constituents, and people have to listen to their constituents. They put them in those chairs. And so, so I think that's a piece that I know a lot of people in this movement have done a lot of work on, but I would just reinforce the need to really be looking at the coalition building across groups that maybe don't traditionally work together, but also the coalition building around the state, so that when we know what committee we're targeting, we're looking at where do we need, district, whatever it is, and let's get those calls in. And when we've been able to do that, I think we've been effective. And when we haven't, that's when these bills have died.
And Tamara, in your response, I'd like you to also talk about the role of youth, that we have the Sunrise Movement that we're all really inspired by. This webinar is going to be shared with our hashtag Make Climate a Class in colleges and universities. We have students who are listening now. We have more who are going to be participating. There's a comment about middle school students. So in building and broadening and making our coalitions more effective, how do we better respond to the leadership that youth is providing. Let's put it that way.
Well, as an aging ally, I have a lot of the middle of the road opinions about that. What I would say is that I think that the work must be multiracial and it must be multi-generational. So the energy that it takes to do this work is youth energy. The wisdom that it takes to survive it is less useful. Is less youthful. So I think the best combination of the two, the killer punch that actually makes people show up, is some of what Lorig referred to: strange bedfellows. There are reasons why we are stratified in society across classifications, categories, and in a system. The best way to shock the system is to pick a partner for whom you have enough things in common that you can work together. You can be comrades as you do the work. You can be constituents because you are working towards a plan. Whether or not you become confidants that work together to really move the work is a choice that you make. But in the state of Maryland, there are so many things that rural and urban communities can do together to make change. They face the same actors doing the same things to them in a slightly different landscape. And every time they show up as enemies instead of partners, the game is already lost. So I think in Maryland and the movement in particular, we just need to get used to the idea that the system itself is the thing that we're working against, the slowness, the money that's built into it, the confusion and disinformation that can be injected into any and every one of these issues. There's not a single issue that has been mentioned here today where people are not diffusing the power of agreement. In order, the sort of real enemy that we face is a lack of agreement by people that we want to solve problems. In my former work in the Maryland Environmental Health Network, one of the things that we did really well was put together impacted communities with health professionals who could be validators because the system requires that, and work with legislators who wanted to take that case the rest of the way. So it was a tripart system of people really doing the work of advocacy and making the issue real and talking about what solutions might happen and working together as a team to make it happen. So I do think it's really important for us to take the leadership of the youth to expect that folks that have been there before have things to offer, and build the best possible case that you can for a solution, and work with as many people as will come with you, because we need all of them. These problems are interrelated and connected, and the only thing that can stop us is a failure to agree. So at the meta level, I think that's true. In Annapolis, you also have the distinction of it basically being an island in the state. If you rely on public transportation, it is a gauntlet, to say the least. And so one of the good things that comes from building relationships and having a network is being able to get the number of rides it will take to sit in a room where you can potentially talk for 1 or 2 or 3 minutes after waiting an entire day, to legislators who have been up for 12 hours listening to people talk in 1, 2, and 3 minute increments. So part of why you need a team to do this work and to build across all the places that it shows up in children and youth work and environmental health spaces, everywhere where people and planet is affected, is because it is the only way to survive the way that we are held back by bureaucracy, which is designed to make things slow. I mean, at the end of the day, we're making decisions for generations, so it moves slowly. Our job as activists is to insert some urgency into the system and to push with the energy to make it to the end of the debate.
Okay, Mike, I know you want to jump in here.
I would just say amen to everything my two colleagues just said. So they said it well, and I'm sure there are other questions.
Okay, all right. Yeah, there are a lot of questions. And I will say that Lori has been not only feeding these to me, but has been categorizing them. And so this will make a very nice summary of the questions that we can share with all of our wonderful speakers. And we'll find some way, if people do want to give written answers, to get it back to everybody who's registered. So let's talk maybe specifically about transportation, because there are a couple questions about transportation. Tamara, you mentioned just the challenge that people have when they're disenfranchised in terms of public transportation, can't afford transportation themselves, probably can't make the $100 contribution to CCAN to be entered into your raffle for a Tesla, Mike. But no, seriously, but there's some big issues in terms of transportation in Maryland, whether it's the expansion of the superhighways to funding of public transportation, and transportation is about at least a third of the sectoral-based greenhouse gas emissions. So what can we really be doing to be cutting our emissions through transportation, as well as improving access to transportation? Whoever wants to jump on that.
Well, I will say that we have to electrify everything in our society. We know that. We have to stop lighting anything on fire to keep the lights on or power our vehicles or heat and cool our buildings. So we have to electrify everything, including the transportation sector. Obviously, electric cars are coming, as even Goodstein said. There are European car makers that are already committed to no longer building internal combustion engines. There's a lot that we can do in Maryland, and I think Lorig's more expert on what has happened and what's coming. But I do know that 1 in 10 people who turn in a vehicle now do not buy a new one. 1 in 10 people in this country who sell their existing cars don't replace it. So we're getting to fewer and fewer cars in this country, which is positive. And the cars that remain need to be electric. We need to have electric trains. And we need to, I agree with you, Tamara, the fact that it is hard to get to Annapolis except in an individual vehicle, and we need to change that. But back to the stimulus component of, we're going to be in a multi-month, probably a multi-year period of economic recovery, and that is going to require new infrastructure. We have infrastructure that already needs to be built in our state and across this country that's already in the queue. What we don't need to do is build new roads. I think we all agree that we don't want to expand the Beltway, which is Governor Hogan, with a straight face, has said he thinks that expanding the Beltway is a way to reduce global warming pollution, and there's no evidence, and it's just ridiculous on its face. So in terms of the infrastructure we need to build moving forward, not new roads for more cars, but the Red Line in Baltimore. We need transit to Southern Maryland. We need transit to Annapolis. And it needs to entirely be electrified. And there are some bills one bill that did pass this year, and more that we need to pass in coming years on that.
Yeah, I would just, I'll just reinforce that and just talk also about just the equity piece in transportation and transportation planning, the public transportation, the Red Line that was canceled by this governor. The first thing he did was cancel the Red Line in Baltimore, which was, this sort of classic model of both a project that creates greater equity, greater access to jobs, and reduces the carbon impact of our transportation system. So the investment in public transit is crucial, as well as electrifying both public and private transportation. I think that, again, one of the things that's really interesting about these debates that we've been having, a lot of us have been really fighting against the expansion of the Beltway and the Lexus lanes that was going to be kind of based in, which again, you have the cross intersectionality of the equity and the greenhouse gas emissions. And in that expansion, in this crisis that we're now facing, one of the things that we're seeing is that in fact, the Lexus lane model, when the money doesn't go to the companies that have made those investments, there is an expectation that the taxpayers will bail them out. And that's kind of been an ongoing conversation as it relates to the Beltway expansion. And now we're seeing that pressure for that bailout in the states that have them, where they're not getting the money because the congestion's off the road. And then even in Australia, where one of the companies that's looking to bid in Maryland is based. So again, I think it's an opportunity to take a look at where we are now, the lessons that we're learning from this moment, and organize moving forward. I just want to highlight one other thing, if I could back up for a minute. I want to remind folks, so back to what I was saying about the special session. I hope we have one. I think there's really urgent work to do. We may or may not. But I want to remind folks that the things that get done in Annapolis in January, February, and March are the things that we're building right this minute. So whether or not we get together in, whether or not the legislature gets together to take a vote in June or July, the organizing and the planning and the building of the coalitions for the 2021 session needs to have been happening, 2 years ago. So let's get started. Let's get started now with whatever it is that folks want to be building towards. Whether that's directing a federal stimulus package, directing the Maryland stimulus package, as well as all the good work that's been being done that hasn't moved forward, and that we need to really build the coalitions around to make sure that they do move forward.
So I apologize for leaving this to what is probably going to be the last question, but we have about 20% of the registrants are local government officials. We focus mostly on state level action, but clearly local government is a key driver, a key implementer of policy in terms of really affecting people and people's lives. So what are we seeing out of local government, and what are ways that state and local government can be working better together in greenhouse gas reduction and climate justice?
Well, first, a shout out to my city council in Tacoma Park, which people love to, in the media, love to caricature as the Berkeley of the East. But the reality is our city council early in March committed by resolution, and a strong resolution that has the statutory force, to getting to net zero carbon for the entire city by 2035. And I want to thank Peter Kovar, my council member, who I think is on the call, for helping to lead that fight, and our mayor, Kate Stewart. Basically, I just think local governments there's a lot that local governments can do, and I encourage people, if you want to learn more about the Tacoma Park resolution, check it out. Montgomery County, a county of over 1 million people, is also declared a climate emergency, and is moving forward, not as fast as many of us had hoped, but it is moving toward taking real action. And I do think that at the local level, we're also going to have to think about ways that we can create more jobs than we thought otherwise because of the economic turndown. And it has to be jobs for the most affected, most vulnerable communities. So there's a lot that governments can do. There's a lot that city and county governments are doing in Maryland. And I think the challenge is going to be there even more to set great examples at local levels for the rest of the state and the nation.
Okay, anybody else want to comment on that?
I just say that I think when I was talking about plastic bag bans earlier, I mentioned that I think when there is a real role, and sometimes it can feel like if we're just this city with 6,000 people or 5,000 or 10,000 or 2,000 people, but when all the local municipalities, or certainly the counties, start moving the needle on things like plastic bag bans, and create that sort of a patchwork, it makes it much easier for state government to say, well, look, we've already got 20% of the state banning them, and so the retailers now want more uniformity, so let's move forward on this. So I do think that a lot of times, even when it seems the building the model at the local level, and this is the same way I feel about the state, right? I mean, when we build, sometimes it can feel like, well, yeah, sure, it would be better if this was done at the federal level, but if we can do this at the state level, and then you get enough states doing it, you create that tipping point that puts the pressure on the federal government. The same is true with local government in the state, that puts the pressure on the state government. And so frankly, it was why the community choice energy was such an attractive build model to me, still is an attractive model, because it allows local government and local control and local democratic process to really control the energy supply decisions in the state. The other thing that I just want to say in breaking all of the rules is David told me that I couldn't talk about capacity markets, but I saw that people had questions about capacity markets. I'm not going to answer them now. That's FERC. That's FERC and PJM and MOPR. But I will tell people who are interested that I am still actively working on the issue. So shoot me an email, and tell you all about it.
Great, so thank you. So I think that I do want to just bring us to a conclusion here, because we've been on for an hour and a half. And before I thank the speakers, I want to thank all of you. We still have 85 of you, or almost 85 of you in addition to us, who are on this. And you are, you are our hope. You are our inspiration. You are our leaders in many ways in making these things happen. I want to also shout out to the many students who are going to be listening as we keep pushing the hashtag Make Climate a Class. And one of the things that we want to ask everybody who's on the webinar is to talk to teachers that you know, and the education world, like everything else, is topsy-turvy. Teachers are looking for online content. We now have 90 minutes of online content. We have teacher's guides in 25 subjects on the website. So what we'll be doing with our Solve Climate by 2030 project is we will be, with thanks to our friends at Mount St. Mary's University, we'll be sharing this recording and the recording of the other webinars on that website. We will save the chat, because there's lots of good ideas here, and I will email that out to everybody who has registered for the webinar here. And I guess the other thing, just to remind people, and with everything that's going on, is that in 2 weeks is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. This webinar is actually one of the official activities of the Earth Day Network, which is said to pivot to virtual Earth Day. But even as we're sequestered at home and very concerned about the health of our loved ones and our communities, that we need to keep moving forward and preventing the next catastrophe, which is what this is all about. So I want to thank our participants. I want to thank Lorig and Tamara and Mike, not only for your time today, but for all of your leadership. And we thank you all for joining us today. So
Thank you, David.
Thanks for the great conversation and questions, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all.
Right, and we will be saving the questions in the chat and getting that to everybody.